Lesson 3, Roman Names. In the last lesson, we talked about the topic of speaking Latin, which we believe is very important, not only because it's fun and it makes it more fun to learn, but you also end up learning the language better and faster too. And when you speak Latin, one of the first things that you find that you need is a Latin name. You need some kind of name that people can use to talk to you.
So, Bill, why don't we start there? If we're speaking in Latin, what should I call you?
Well, my name in English is William. My friends call me Bill. But in Latin, the way to say William is Gulielmus.
Ah.
That's where we get, like in Spanish, you get the word Guillermo. And I believe in French, Guillaume. What about you? What should I call you in Latin?
Well, my Latin name is Meletus.
Is there a story about that you can tell us?
There is, but I'll say two things. That first, that's not the normal Latin name for Michael. Michael in origin is actually a Hebrew name. And in Latin we would say it Mikael. So most of the Michaels you meet are going to be called that. My name, however, was given to me by a friend. It is actually the famous accuser of Socrates in the ancient Greek Apology of Socrates written by Plato while we were discussing philosophy stuff one day. And it's a pun on my last name, Sweet, because it sounds very much like the Greek word for sweet. Well, one of the Greek words for sweet, and like the Latin word mel, which is honey.
Yeah, it means honey, right?
That's exactly it.
So that's a nice name, honey.
Oh.
You'll notice that since Michael and I are both male, our Latin names end with US. That's the masculine second declension ending. So Gulielmus, M-U-S, Meletus ends with a U-S. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how some of these names function in conversation. In the next lesson, Lesson 4, we're going to talk about how to pick a name. But in this lesson, we wanted to just tell you a little bit about Roman names in general. And I made a little diagram for you here. I just thought it would be fun to talk about the traditional Roman name. I have here a diagram of Julius Caesar's name. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar.
Or if you prefer, Gaius Julius Caesar.
When I say Gaius Julius Caesar, that's a very anglicized way to pronounce the name. So as you can see, there are three parts to the name: the praenomen, the nomen, and the cognomen.
So you'll notice in the middle there, nomen, which is our Latin word for name.
We have a lot of related English words, don't we? Like nomenclature, nominate, nominal, words like that, right?
That's exactly it.
So if you learn the nomenclature associated with a certain topic, that means you're learning the terms, the terminology associated with a certain topic.
Right. It's how we label things.
Right, names. So the nomen in the middle, that's like the extended family clan of an ancient Roman. That name might extend back a long time. That's the middle name, Julius. On the left, we have the praenomen, which is the person's personal name.
And you might be asking why we actually brought up nomen before we brought up praenomen, even though they're in that order. And it's because I wanted to point out for you the pri part of the word praenomen. Pri is a Latin prefix and a Latin preposition that means before. So your praenomen is literally your before your name, your before name. We would, of course, call it a first name, but we're not ancient Romans.
I would try to ask you what your praenomen is, but I don't want to pry.
Previously.
Anyway, and now on to the cognomen. You know, within these extended, large Roman family clans, we might call them, there were different branches of the family. And sometimes each branch of the family would get a certain cognomen that goes with that particular branch.
So oftentimes the cognomen came about as a nickname, much in the way that our last names in English came about. So let's take the typical John Smith, unidentifiable person name. In medieval times, you would name somebody John, and maybe in your village there are 700 Johns. So they start saying, oh, well, that's John the Smith, the guy that makes the nails in our village. And so the Latin names that came after the nomen, these cognomina, like we would say in the plural, some of them, at least, came about in this exact same way.
Because Smith is just short for blacksmith, right?
Exactly.
Someone who works with metal, a metal worker. So that's the kind of way that these cognomina got started.
And you won't see it here on the chart, but these nicknames could sometimes start to pile up, especially later on as emperors conquered more and more territories. And sometimes you'll hear these referred to as ognomina in the single and ognomen, but you don't have to worry about that too much.
An ognomen is just an extra name that gets tagged onto the end, right?
Yeah, think of it as a specific nickname.
As the Roman Empire went on, the naming scheme changed and people could collect more and more of these names, right?
Exactly. Well, one of the things maybe that we should point out here is so far we've actually only been talking about male names and only been talking about aristocratic people. Can you talk a little bit, Bill, about what we mean when we say that someone's an aristocrat?
The basic naming scheme that we're talking about here, this three-part name, it mainly, as far as our knowledge goes, it mainly applied to the upper class people. And so that's, when we look at Latin literature, that's really the kind of person we know the most about, because those were the people in charge, the people with the money. And so we have sort of an unbalanced amount of knowledge about the upper class people, and we know less about middle class and poor people.
Especially from their own ways of speaking. The primary way that we know about lower class and middle class people in ancient Rome is through things like inscriptions, through letters we find in the deserts of Egypt, and some of them do have these three-part names, but it's not a universal phenomenon.
So there was a lot of variation in names. What we wanted to do in this lesson was just give you a quick overview of the main traditional Roman name. And moving on to female names, probably the most important thing to know is that a woman born into an aristocratic family would have the nomen as her name, but in feminine form. So if someone is born into the Julius clan, her name would be Julia. So you change the ending from masculine to feminine, and you get Julia. Cornelius becomes Cornelia. So that main family name, that nomen, is going to become the girl's name, but in feminine form. So before we move on to lesson 4, let's look at this quick review.
So we're talking about the ablative of means this time, which sometimes is called the ablative of instrument. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct. So in the first example here, you have the sword in the ablative case. It's being used to defend the island. And then in the second example, you have the word for wood, that's lignum, in the ablative singular. It's being used to build a wall.
So let's just read those two sentences. I'll take the first one, and why don't you take the second one? Ego insulam gladio et scuto servo.
Murum ligno aedifico. So you learned this in Getting Started with Latin. I reviewed it quite a bit, but here it's in the quick review box just to remind you of it as we go on, because you're going to see it in lots of the exercises.